So, the surprise. The idea behind the surprise is that this kind of combat starts at the highest point of intensity, and then as you hit that spike, it kind of tapers off. And then if you want a longer version, you can spike again and then taper again. So you do this really, it's pretty easy. If you spring the fight on the players really out of nowhere, then, suddenly, hence the name, then players are kind of caught out of position and unprepared, and that's what helps a lot to create the tension at the very beginning. Once it kind of tapers off, you probably want to end the fight pretty quickly. If you want the fight to go longer, you can, but you need to make sure that there's another second spike so that the curve kind of goes, like this. And then once you have that second spike, you want to do the same thing where you end it really before it starts to taper off too much. What you're looking for here is to really end the fight before it feels like the fight has a really strong resolution. That's important because the idea of the surprise is to have what happened in that fight really contextualize the rest of what they're doing in a particular area or segment or space. Now, even with these longer versions, you can still accomplish that, but again, just make sure you're ending the fight before there's any real significant tapering of intensity. You can also do shorter versions of this. A shorter version of this is really straightforward. You can actually make it less than a round, and if you do a surprise and you make it last less than a round, what you've done is you've created a trap, which just happens and then goes away, and it takes like 2 seconds. Same kind of thing where it just makes the players kind of more aware of the environment. Now, what you should be looking at is making the shortest possible encounter to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. So if the only thing you're trying to pull off is the idea that your players should be really worried about the environment and just to communicate to them, hey, things are dangerous, you should be a little slower, a little bit more careful, a little bit more thoughtful about what you're doing. Sometimes a trap or two is all you need. But in situations where you want a more substantive opening to an area where the players are really going to be worried and tense for most of that area, something like an encounter like the surprise is ideal, because what ends up happening is they can go through this process of spikes and falls and spikes, and by going through that, they'll kind of learn not to be comfortable, especially if you do a longer encounter. And that's the value of a longer, more closer to 5-round encounter for the surprise, is that the intensity starts to taper off, but then it spikes again, and players, just as they start to feel more comfortable, you hit them with another spike in intensity, and now they don't know what to do. I mean, they probably know what to do, but they're worried. They're even more worried. And then next time they start to feel a little bit more comfortable in a fight, well, they probably won't, because they've learned that comfort is bad, that complacency is death. So you need to be very careful. But if you do it right, you can actually make a really interesting encounter that is by itself really engaging and really interesting, but also does a lot to highly contextualize everything else that the players do after, because it's really important to remember that a player experience isn't just the thing that they did. A player experience is the players do a thing, and then once they finish the thing, they have a memory of that experience. So what actually contextualizes what they do next has to do with the memory of that experience, not the actual events of that experience. That's really important, and that's what the surprise is really good at playing with. So when you're designing for the surprise, the first thing you want to do is determine your target length based on what you're trying to accomplish. So just like what I just talked about, you want to look at things like, how long do I need the fight to be? How strongly does it need to contextualize everything that's happening? Is it just a matter of making the players a little bit more worried about their environment? If so, maybe a trap or two is good enough. If not, maybe I want a longer surprise, a 2-round surprise to really make them worry about what's around them, but then that's enough. Or maybe you want to do a much longer thing. A 5-round surprise is a good way to start a horror segment, because what you do is you create tension, then the tension starts to resolve as the players get closer to victory in the encounter, or to overcoming the encounter. Then you spike it again. And what that does is it makes players worried that that's going to happen, even if things start to resolve. And that's going to create a lot of underlying tension, so that players have a sense of anxiety and worry about them, even if the encounter is close to resolving. Now, if you're doing horror, if you've heard of the tension release cycle, which I won't get into in detail in this video, but if you've heard of it, then great. The idea is you still want to resolve tension sometimes, but if you want to maintain tension and make sure that players are constantly worried, you want to make it so that they can't always rely on the resolution of tension. And a 5-round surprise does a great job of that. So here's an example of a surprise that is only about 2 rounds. Imagine the assassin creature. The assassin creature is a CR8 creature. It has sneak attack, and it has the assassin trait from the rogue subclass. The assassin has an AC of 15, an HP of 78, and a CR8, and that means that against a party of an appropriate level, the assassin will die pretty quick. You can also have the assassin get out of there as quickly as possible, which can help because then they know that the assassin is out there somewhere, and that also can help create tension. It also helps you make sure that your target length is hit. If you're trying to go for 2 rounds, you know, give it 2 attacks. If it's not dead, have it leave. Maybe even have it leave after 1 round, because you're not stuck to either less than a round, 2 rounds, or 5 rounds. Just remember that the length of the encounter that you're going for is really important, and you should have already established that by this point. So it's not always just a matter of which creature do I need to create this encounter length. It's a matter of how do I want the creature to act. So the assassin could retreat. If the assassin retreats, you can have the encounter go shorter, no problem. So other things about the assassin, it has high dexterity, which helps make it go first. You could even push that further by giving it some kind of initiative advantage or some kind of other bonus to initiative to make sure that it really hits. It doesn't have to go first in the turn order necessarily, but you generally don't want it to go like last, because then that initial spike in intensity where suddenly something pops out and starts to attack you, it's not that scary if it pops out and then there's 4 or 5 people that are just wailing on it, and then it has to run away. So you want it to get at least 1 round in. That's really important. Now, the assassinate and sneak attack traits together mean that it's gonna be nasty on its first turn, especially if it's popping out of nowhere and it gets an attack before an initiative really starts. If it gets a surprise round, it does so much damage. And that means that players are gonna be really afraid of that thing. Even if actually they could take it down very easily, maybe even before it gets another turn, because it can do so much damage out the gate, players are going to be worried about its potential. And that's the important thing. And then if the assassin gets away, they're going to be even more worried about it because they're not going to know what to expect. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't, they don't know. That's tension. A second example for a longer fight would be what I'm going to call the graveyard. Imagine that your players are walking through a quiet graveyard, and a shadow moves across the ground. Players look up, and they see something flying overhead, something fairly large that they can't make out. They walk a little longer. There's silence. There's an eerie stillness from the graveyard. Suddenly, hands burst up from the ground and reach out to grab them. Make grapple checks and roll initiative. As soon as you do that, intensity is really high, because people are they're going to know exactly what's happening, right? Hands bursting out of the ground in a graveyard is a pretty iconic sort of image. But because it's happening so suddenly, these hands can work in a number of ways. If you want a shorter encounter, you can have them just make the grapple checks and then have the zombies very slowly crawl out of their graves, which means those hands function basically like a trap. If they immediately run, then I mean, that's it. You accomplished the trap, basically. A sub 1 round surprise. Just one thing happened really quickly, the players got out. But if somebody doesn't succeed their save, somebody doesn't succeed their grapple check, then the hands come up and they grab somebody, but not everybody. And now the players have to decide, are we going to try to grab them and run, or are we going to try to fight this thing? And zombies are starting to crawl out of the graveyards. And in this instance, you can have them crawl out a little bit faster, so that the party's actually going to start getting surrounded by zombies if they don't do something. So this works really well as the opening to an encounter, because the players are just wandering along and then suddenly this thing happens. Because their focus was lifted upward by the shadow and the whatever was above them, what that does is it makes it that they're even more concerned about their surroundings, because you're showing them things can happen around you that aren't necessarily things that you'll notice. So they can happen suddenly, so that makes them want to be more aware of things. Players are going to be wary of returning to the graveyard later if they do escape, if they do get out. Especially, there's even more tension if you as the DM somehow make it clear to them, hey, you have to go back to this graveyard for some reason, and they're already afraid of it. So now you have this area, this space that's been defined by the hands bursting out of the ground, and that's all you need. But you can take it even further. If they don't run, you can turn it into a short surprise encounter where a couple of zombies start hitting them. And you go back to what I was talking about earlier, where when the zombies hit them, they hit them pretty hard. Maybe not too hard, because there's a lot of zombies, and maybe each zombie only hits once, but just make sure that the zombies are doing decent damage, because you want the players to be really worried about their ability to get out of that encounter, even though the design of the encounter will definitely allow them to succeed and escape. Now, imagine your players start to try to fight off those zombies, but they just kind of keep coming. And zombie hands keep emerging from graveyards from the graves as they pass by. Now players are going to be very careful about where they step, but there's a new tension, trying to get away as quickly as possible while also being very wary of what's coming out of the ground. And that's going to create a really interesting round of decisions where we're wondering, you know, maybe you have disadvantage on perception checks to see them because you're running. If you slow down, then you don't have disadvantage on those checks anymore, something like that, so that there's all this tension, and the mechanics that you put in really bolster that tension. But either way, what you've got is the environment is dangerous. Be very careful about where you're going and where you're stepping. And for you, mission accomplished, and the encounter has done everything it needed to do. Then they get to their destination, wherever they're going. And the figure they saw overhead, which they've mostly forgotten about because of the high intensity level of this encounter, appears. And that's your basic setup payoff. And that's important because we used that as kind of a red herring, so that when the thing flew above them, they looked up, but then something came out of the ground to surprise them. And that helps really bolster the surprise element. But if that red herring flew overhead and then was never seen again, it would feel really cheap. It would feel like a red herring, like it was just there to sort of cheaply get them to look somewhere else. And that's really bad because you undermine your ability to do that later if they start to realize that. So always make sure that you pay off your red herrings. You don't actually need a red herring, but they can be useful in this kind of encounter because of the example. You look at, if you have your players looking up and then having something coming out of the ground from beneath them, they're not prepared for that. And what you do is you sort of almost punish them for not being prepared for something, but in a way that really just incentivizes them to try to be more prepared. And as you incentivize players to be more prepared, but you're trying to incentivize them to be prepared for things and they can't possibly be prepared for everything, then you create tension, because now there's something that they think they need to be prepared for, but they also know they're not prepared for. That's so perfect, because then players are worried, because then they're going, well, we need to be worried about X, but we can't keep track of X because we're keeping track of A, B, and C. If you have your characters keeping track of A, B, and C, and they just can't also keep track of X, now they're worried about X, and it doesn't even matter if X exists in your designs anymore. They're worried about it, and that creates tension. And that's the power of the surprise encounter. So that's really 3 ways that you can do it. Again, you don't have to go with either sub 1, 2, or 5 rounds. Those are the examples because they're kind of the ideal lengths for being able to do the curves that I've described. But if you follow the curves and you look at them and you just ask yourself, how can I make this curve work? How can I add elements so that this curve functions in this way, but then truncates at this point? You should be fine. So I really hope that the surprise encounter is something that you can try to implement. And again, there's a lot of different kinds of encounters. Do not think of the surprise encounter as the end-all be-all encounter. It's one kind and it serves a very particular function, but it serves it very well. So I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that you try to implement the surprise encounters for you. And if you do, let me know how it goes. Be really interested to hear. Okay, that's it for me. Bye now.